Hello and welcome. What are men looking for in women? And what is it women find attractive in men? You're probably aware of the stereotype. Men are shallow and focus on beauty over brains, while women are looking for intelligence and ambition. But does it ring true? In one study conducted over 2 years in New York City, a team of professors found that our assumptions are generally true, but they also found a number of trends that might surprise you, proving that although the times have changed, we have not. In today's day and age, women hold positions of power equal to and above those of men. Women such as Hillary Clinton, Condoleezza Rice, and even Benazir Bhutto are breaking through the glass ceiling and setting new standards. How are men responding to these changes when looking for a partner? Are women having to dumb themselves down for men? Remember, we take your phone calls and questions on this show. The number's there at the bottom of your screen. Joining me to discuss his research into the search for a mate is Professor Raymond Fisman, who teaches at Columbia University in New York. Professor, good to have you with us.
It's good to be here.
I've got to start off by asking you now, how does a professor of economics get involved in this kind of study? Is it something, personal experience, bad experiences with women got you looking into this, or is there a business or a market element to this?
Well, first of all, I think if you polled my ex-girlfriends, they would be unanimous in the view that I'm far from an expert on anything related to dating in practice. The way I got into this, I should actually start out by saying I spent most of my life studying corruption and political economy. And if we have a chance, maybe I'll say something about how this actually connects to the study of dating. The way this actually started was I was actually at a party with some number of psychologists and was talking to one of them about this question of what do men look for in women, what do women look for in men. And from an economics perspective, she was talking about some of the evidence from psychology on what people say they value in a partner. And the economist's reaction to most types of survey evidence is we call it cheap talk. We don't believe what people say, we believe what people reveal through their actions. So this kind of led to a longer conversation about how if one wanted to find out kind of what people reveal about dating preferences, how you would go about doing that. So the psychologist, Sheena Iyengar, and I started running our own dating service on the Columbia campus.
Well, I have to ask you
the roots of how economics met dating.
Well, let me ask you what you discovered in your research that surprised you.
Okay, so I think there were actually a number of surprises. If I think about the very first thing that comes to mind, what surprised me was actually some of the things that didn't surprise me, which is to say a lot of these stereotypes that you mentioned in your introduction actually seemed to play out in this group of graduate students at Columbia University where you might least expect to find them. So we certainly found that men seem to put more emphasis on looks than women, and that's perhaps not going to shock or stun any of your viewers. But also, as you mentioned, this fact that men, in this case male graduate students at Columbia University, seemed to be averse to women who exceeded them in certain domains. In particular, they were averse to women who were more intelligent than they were, or who they perceived to be more ambitious than themselves. And that's not to say that men did not like intelligence. It's to say that there was a limit. So Moore was good up to his own level of intelligence, and then it was only downhill thereafter. Now, I will say that these are...
I was going to ask you, Professor, just in what way, I mean, obviously the issue of men and women and their preferences is a time immemorial thing, and I wonder in what way this study differs from others that have looked at the same kind of issues between men and women.
Okay, so first of all, I think that what is useful here is because we were running our own dating service, I should say a little bit about what we were doing. We're running what's called a speed dating service, which really is exactly what it sounds like. It's a very rapid-fire way of men meeting a bunch of women and women meeting a bunch of men in the course of an evening. So women and men are paired up for 3, 4, 5 minutes at a time. They talk. At the end of this miniature date, they decide if they want a real date, and if they both are agreeable, then they'll get the other person's contact information the next day. So this allowed us to collect a bunch of information on dating preferences where, again, there were real stakes. It's not just a survey. And also, we could randomly pair people. So let's say you're interested in something like racial preferences in dating. It's a little difficult to figure this out just from observing who marries whom, because it could be that white people only marry white people because we live in a fairly segregated society. So there's very little intermixing of races.
Now, I gather,
so what we were able to do...
sorry, Professor, I was going to say, I gather Go ahead. I was going to say, I gather that from your research that effectively that men are less preferential when it comes to race, though. Isn't that correct?
Yes, so that's exactly it. So suppose you're interested in racial preferences. We were able to create this kind of intermixing in our laboratory, or it actually took place in a local bar. And that's exactly what we find. This is something else that was quite surprising to us. What was surprising was not that there existed racial preferences, but there was this very stark asymmetry between women and men in same-race preferences. That women cared a lot about having a partner of the same race, whereas men cared not at all. So we can at least say that we men are non-discriminating, at least in this positive sense.
Professor, I've got to ask you, I mean, from your own, what you've discovered in this, how do you explain that difference? What is it about the psychology of men and women that makes it so distinct the way you found it?
Yeah, I think that we would shy away from saying anything about whether it's socialization or some deep underlying physiological difference. You can certainly tell stories about why women biologically would have greater concern for matching with someone of the same race as them. And generally why women would be looking for someone who's more likely to make parental investments of the type that would require greater intelligence and ambition. We actually shy away from doing that. Because I think you can actually construct any story. You can construct a story to explain any result that you might find. I think what we are more interested in is documenting these patterns, and to the extent that we think that it's unfortunate that we find these patterns, these preferences among modern daters. Right. Think about how we might work to change these things. So how can we set up dating institutions, dating arrangements to perhaps de-emphasize the things that we think are less positive?
Well, let's put you on the spot, Professor, and ask, if you're being honest, would you say you fit into the stereotype of what you found?
Yeah, so I have to tell a short story in response to this, which is so I very happily married, and when my now wife was first telling her grandmother about me, her grandmother gave her some stern grandmotherly advice, which was never let a man think you're smarter than he is. Men don't like that. And we all kind of had a laugh about about this anachronistic view of the world. And of course, we found that that's exactly the patterns that we observe among Columbia graduate students. But the fact is, I married a woman who was far smarter than I am, and I actually tell her grandmother at every opportunity how happy I am that I've married someone who's smarter than me. And whenever I talk about this stuff, there will always be a woman in the audience who comes down afterwards and says, I'm just like the men in your study. And my response is always, that's fine, I'm just like the women. Like there's plenty of differences out there in the world. And something that I do emphasize is the fact that this is a description of what the average male is like. So that's a little depressing. But it's certainly not a description of what all men are like.
If it's any consolation, my wife's the one with the PhD in the family. Let me get an email question into you that came in from California here in the USA, and Heba Najjar wrote in asking, do you think you would have the same results in other parts of the world?
Yeah, that's a great question. First of all, I think it's very surprising that we find these patterns in this particular population. And I am sure that if we ran this study in Scandinavia, which is remarkably progressive in terms of gender equity, gender equality, that we'd observe different patterns. So I'm sure there would be differences across cultures. One kind of interesting finding that we find in our data is, for example, we find much stronger same-race preferences among both men and women for people who grew up in the deep south of the United States, which suggests that you would find some of the differences that your viewer is alluding to. That's something which I personally don't plan to pursue, but there are other people who've kind of picked up on this method of looking at dating preferences, who are running similar experiments in other countries.
We have an email that came in from Virginia here in the US too, and Joan Ahmed wrote in saying, some men find smart women more interesting and invigorating to live with, but in general women do tend to tone down their smarts when they're around new men that they want to get close to. Bill knew Hillary was really smart when he dated her. And it makes me wonder, does dumbing down work in the long run? I mean, eventually, surely a smart woman is going to want to express that intelligence, that it's, that initial show must surely wear off.
Yeah, so a couple of things. First of all, it may be that very intelligent women may want to pair themselves with a man who is not average in terms of wanting to pair himself with a less intelligent woman. The other element to this is not speaking from looking at the data in the study, but just kind of casual observation, is that what seems to be threatening is a woman who exceeds her partner sort of in terms of professional attainment. And you can imagine that among graduate students, their best indicator of that in a forward-looking sense is how intelligent that person is on first meeting. So it's entirely possible that I get paired, as it happens, I got paired with a woman who exceeds me both in terms of intelligence as well as professional attainment, and from my perspective that's just fine. But you can imagine that there are many men who don't mind being with a woman who is more intelligent, just as long as he's the one who gets the greater professional recognition.
Now, interestingly enough, you looked at speed dating, and I wonder, when you look at the information you gathered, the results of your study, how do you balance what would be a look at casual dating as opposed to those who are looking to seriously settle down, because that correlation may not match?
Yeah, so a couple of things. First, there are very interesting studies going on right now. The ones that I'm aware of are actually mostly in India, that are looking at a very different kind of matching market. That is to say, the marriage match, where the decision isn't necessarily made by the people getting married themselves. And so you can easily imagine that you would get a different, a very different pattern in the data there. Also, I think it is important to keep in mind this distinction that you're highlighting, that we are looking at a 4-minute version of love and relationships. I think that the fact that first impressions do seem to matter so much, there are lots of studies on this, suggests that there is at least some connection between what we're attracted to in the course of 4 minutes and what we are attracted to longer term, that these 4-minute results would also be indicative of at least some amount of what people prefer in the longer term.
Now, of course, we like to get the views of the average member of the public, and we went out and actually asked a few people. So let's listen to some of the responses we got.
I think most men appreciate a challenge, and smart, intelligent women pose such a challenge.
I can only answer from my perspective, and I have very smart women that work with us, and I'm not intimidated by them.
Any smart man shouldn't be intimidated by a smart woman, so they feel, They feel like they're going to possibly lose their job or lose their masculinity in some form by, working with or being up face to face with a smart woman.
They always say they want a smarter woman, but when they get one, they don't have any clue how to deal with it.
Listening to those, Professor, are you surprised at what you hear there from that selection of men and women?
Not in the slightest. And in fact, that lines up perfectly with not just my view of how people respond to this question, but also what we observe in our data. So before these speed daters showed up at our event, we actually asked them, what are you looking for in a mate? What are you looking for in a partner? And we also asked them, what do you think the average person of your gender is looking for? So men, when asked this question, all responded, what I'm looking for is an intelligent, sensitive woman. All those other men, they're just looking for a good-looking woman. And if you think about that, that's basically saying that everyone thinks that they care less about looks and more about intelligence than the average. It's impossible for us to all be, in some sense, better than the average. So your last interviewee, the woman who said, when you ask a man, he'll say what he cares about is sincerity and intelligence, but when I look at his actions, this is what I see. Right. I think that sums up our study perfectly.
Now, we've got less than a minute with you now, Professor. Let's get a quick idea of what you're doing next. I know you have some interesting projects in mind.
Actually, most of what I'm working on these days does relate to violence, corruption, and poverty. And I actually have a book coming out next year called Economic Gangsters, which is about this set of issues. I remain very interested in the psychology of dating kind of as a side interest, but really what I would like to understand or spend my life understanding is why are poor countries poor. So that's mostly what I'm thinking about these days.
Perhaps there's a book in looking at the dating preferences of corrupt and violent people as well. Professor, thank you very much for joining us and really appreciate your time. Hope to speak with you about your book very soon.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
I would love to.
Thank you for being with us. Don't forget, if you have any thoughts about pressing issues around the world, we always want your emails to come to us at riz@aljazeera.net. We'll see you next time. Street Talk is next.